She was just 8 years old, shivering in a torn dress. But what she did next would awaken a tradition that had slept for generations. The entire settlement would witness something they thought existed only in the oldest stories their grandparents whispered by firelight. The morning frost clung to the wooden planks of the trading post as Magnolia Voss stepped outside, clutching her small woolen coat tighter around her shoulders. The cold bit through the fabric, but she had grown accustomed to the harsh frontier winters. Her mother, Clementine, was inside negotiating with merchants who had arrived before dawn, their wagon wheels still steaming from the long journey through the mountain passes. Maggie's breath formed small clouds as she wandered toward the settlement's edge, where the wooden buildings gave way to open land. That's when she saw him. An elderly man sat hunched against the outer wall of the blacksmith's shop, his weathered hands trembling as he pulled a thin blanket around his frail frame. His long gray hair was braided with small leather ties, and intricate beadwork adorned what remained of his worn clothing. Sterling Rhodes had been a respected figure among the native tribes for decades, though few in the settlement knew his true standing. The old man's lips had taken on a blue tint, and his entire body shook with each gust of wind that swept down from the mountains. Maggie watched him struggle to keep the inadequate blanket positioned against the cold, but it slipped repeatedly from his shaking fingers. Other townspeople walked past, some glancing briefly at the elderly native man before hurrying along their own business. Nobody stopped. Nobody offered help. Maggie's small hands moved to the buttons of her coat without hesitation. It was the only warm garment she owned, a Christmas gift from her mother who had saved for months to afford it. The coat was slightly too large for her small frame, but it provided essential protection against the unforgiving winter weather. Yet as she watched Sterling suffering, the decision became clear in her young mind. She approached slowly, her footsteps crunching on the frost-covered ground. Sterling raised his weary eyes to meet hers, expecting perhaps another curious stare before she moved along like the others. Instead, Maggie began removing her coat, the cold immediately attacking her thin dress underneath. "Sir, you need this more than I do." Sterling's eyes widened as the child extended her coat toward him. For a moment he remained perfectly still, studying her face for any sign of mockery or jest, but he found only genuine concern and determination in her young features. His gnarled hands reached out slowly, accepting the unexpected gift. The warmth that enveloped him was more than physical. Sterling wrapped the small coat around his shoulders, and for the first time in hours, his shivering began to subside. He looked up at Maggie, who now stood in her thin dress, already beginning to shiver herself, but smiling with satisfaction at his improved condition. What Sterling knew, and what Maggie could never have imagined, was that her simple act had just triggered something sacred. Among his people, there existed an ancient tradition called the Circle of Generosity, a custom that demanded extraordinary responses to extraordinary kindness. It hadn't been invoked in over 30 years, not since his own grandfather's time. As Sterling studied the brave little girl before him, he realized she had unknowingly set in motion events that would change everything. The tradition demanded that such pure generosity be honored in a way that would echo through generations. But first, he had to get word to his nephew Gideon Nash, the current tribal leader, before the sun reached its peak. What happened next would depend on how quickly the ancient wheels of tradition could turn. Sterling's weathered fingers traced the edges of the small coat as he watched Maggie hurry back toward the trading post, her arms wrapped tightly around herself. The child had no idea she had just performed what his people called Sahani Nukwa, the selfless gift that demands honor. His mind raced through the ancient protocols his grandfather had taught him decades ago. The old man struggled to his feet, his joints protesting after hours in the cold. But determination filled his movements. He needed to find his great-nephew immediately. Gideon Nash lived with a small group of tribal members in a settlement about 2 miles east of the town, close enough to trade but far enough to maintain their traditional ways. As Sterling began his journey, each step bringing feeling back to his legs, he reflected on what the tradition would require. The circle of generosity wasn't simply about giving something back. It was about recognizing a pure heart and honoring it in a way that would teach the entire community about the sacred nature of selfless acts. The response had to be proportional not to the gift's material value, but to the sacrifice behind it. Meanwhile, Maggie returned to find her mother emerging from negotiations with the merchants. Clementine's eyes immediately noticed her daughter's missing coat and the goosebumps covering her arms. "Magnolia Voss, where is your coat? I gave it to an old man who was cold. Mama, he needed it more than me." Clementine's expression shifted from concern to gentle pride. though worry still creased her brow. She quickly wrapped her own shawl around Maggie's shoulders and pulled her close. As a widow trying to make ends meet through trading and small crafts, Clementine knew the coat couldn't be easily replaced before winter's end. That was very kind. "Sweetheart, but you'll catch your death in this cold." "I'll be all right, Mama." You should have seen how much he was shaking. 2 hours later, Sterling reached the tribal settlement where several families maintained their traditional lifestyle while adapting to the changing world around them. He found Gideon Nash outside his dwelling, working on repairing a horse bridle. At 45, Gideon possessed the quiet authority that came from years of leading his people through difficult negotiations with settlers and government officials. "Uncle," Sterling called out, using the traditional term of respect. "Something has happened that requires the old ways." Gideon looked up from his work, immediately recognizing the gravity in Sterling's voice. The old man rarely invoked ancient traditions, unless circumstances truly warranted it. As Sterling recounted the morning's events, describing Maggie's unhesitating generosity, Gideon's expression grew more serious. "Sahani Nukwa," Gideon whispered, confirming Sterling's assessment. "It has been many seasons since such purity revealed itself." "The child sacrificed her only protection against winter for a stranger," Sterling continued. Her heart knew no hesitation, no calculation of cost. Gideon stood slowly, his mind already working through what would be required. The circle of generosity demanded a response that would honor not just Maggie, but teach everyone who witnessed it about the sacred nature of selfless giving. But what they planned would require the participation of the entire tribal community, and they had only hours before the ceremony needed to begin. Gideon Nash moved with purpose through the settlement, speaking quietly to each family group. Within minutes, the entire community understood what had transpired and what tradition demanded of them. Elderly women began gathering materials from their most precious possessions, while men prepared for a journey back to the trading post. Children were told the story of Sahani Nukwa, learning about the sacred responsibility that came with witnessing pure generosity. The tribal response wouldn't be simple reciprocity. According to the ancient ways, when someone made a sacrifice that revealed the purest nature of human kindness, the community had to create a moment that would be remembered for generations. The gift given in return had to reflect not just gratitude, but recognition of a spirit that embodied their most sacred values. As the tribal members gathered their contributions, Sterling made his way back toward town, still wearing Maggie's small coat. He needed to observe the child and her family, understanding their circumstances better before the ceremony could proceed. The tradition required that the response be meaningful to the receiver, not just impressive to observers. Back at the trading post, Maggie helped her mother sort through the day's purchases and trades. The cold had made her movements stiff, but she refused to complain. Clementine watched her daughter with growing concern, knowing they couldn't afford to replace the coat until spring brought more trading opportunities. "Maggie, why don't you go warm yourself by the fire while I finish here?" Clementine suggested, noticing her daughter's persistent shivering. As Maggie settled near the fireplace, several townspeople began discussing what they had witnessed that morning. Word of the child's generosity had spread quickly through the small settlement, though reactions varied considerably. "Foolish child," muttered old Henrik, the shopkeeper. "Winter's barely started, and she gives away her only coat." But Martha, the schoolteacher, disagreed. "That child has more sense of right and wrong than most adults in this town. We all saw that old man suffering, but only she acted." Sterling appeared in the doorway just as this conversation reached its peak. Several townspeople recognized him as the recipient of Maggie's kindness, though none knew his true significance within the tribal community. He approached Clementine directly, his manner respectful but purposeful. "Ma'am, your daughter showed me great kindness today," he said, his English careful but clear. "I would like to return her coat, and perhaps speak with you both." Clementine looked up from her work, studying the elderly native man. She could see dignity in his bearing despite his worn clothing. And something else, an intensity that suggested this conversation carried weight beyond simple gratitude. "Of course," she replied. "Maggie, come here, please." As Maggie approached, Sterling knelt to her level, his eyes serious but kind. "Little one, what you did today was more important than you know. Among my people, such generosity is considered sacred." Maggie tilted her head, curious but not understanding the full implications. "I just didn't want you to be cold, sir." "I know." Sterling smiled. "That's what makes it sacred." He paused, choosing his words carefully. My family would like to honor what you did today, in our traditional way. Would you and your mother be willing to visit our settlement before sunset? Clementine hesitated, uncertain about venturing into unfamiliar territory, but something in Sterling's manner suggested this was more than a casual invitation. The respect in his voice, the formality of his request, indicated significance she couldn't yet comprehend. What kind of honor? She asked cautiously. Sterling straightened slowly. The kind that ensures your daughter's generosity is remembered long after we're all gone. Outside, unbeknownst to anyone in the trading post, Gideon Nash and 12 tribal members were already making their way toward town, carrying with them the elements of a ceremony that hadn't been performed in over 30 years. As the afternoon sun began its descent toward the mountains, Clementine found herself walking alongside Sterling on the path leading to the tribal settlement, with Maggie skipping ahead despite the cold. The decision to accept the invitation had come after seeing the genuine respect in Sterling's eyes, something that told her this was about more than simple gratitude. The trading post had buzzed with curious whispers as they departed. Some townspeople expressed concern about Clementine taking her daughter to the native settlement, while others wondered what kind of acknowledgement could warrant such formality. Henrik had shaken his head disapprovingly, but Martha the schoolteacher had encouraged them to go, sensing the significance of the moment. As they approached the settlement, Maggie's eyes widened at the sight before them. The entire tribal community had gathered in a large circle, with men, women, and children all dressed in their finest clothing. Intricate beadwork caught the late afternoon light, and colorful blankets created a striking contrast against the earth tones of the landscape. At the center of the circle sat a beautiful arrangement of handcrafted items, each piece clearly representing hours of skilled work. Gideon Nash stepped forward, his commanding presence immediately evident. He wore ceremonial clothing that spoke of leadership and respect within his community. His voice carried across the gathering as he addressed Clementine and Maggie directly. Mother and daughter, you have been invited here because of an act of pure generosity that has awakened our most sacred tradition. Clementine instinctively placed her hand on Maggie's shoulder, both protective and curious about what was unfolding. The solemnity of the gathering made it clear this was no ordinary expression of thanks. Your daughter, Gideon continued, performed what we call sahani nukwa, the selfless gift. When someone sacrifices their own comfort for a stranger's need, without thought of reward or recognition, it reveals the purest nature of the human spirit. Sterling moved to stand beside his great-nephew, adding his voice to the explanation. In our tradition, such generosity must be honored in a way that teaches everyone who witnesses it about the sacred nature of giving. The gathered tribal members began to speak in turn, each sharing what Maggie's act had meant to them. An elderly woman stepped forward, holding a beautifully crafted pair of winter moccasins, lined with soft fur and decorated with intricate beadwork. These will keep your feet warm when the snows come deep, she said, kneeling before Maggie. A middle-aged man presented a small, carved wooden figure, a protective totem traditionally given to honor courage in children. This represents the brave heart that lives within you. One by one, members of the community came forward, each offering something handmade and precious. A warm blanket woven with patterns that told stories of generosity. A small medicine pouch filled with herbs for health and protection. A beautifully carved comb made from elk horn. But as the gifts accumulated around Maggie, who stood wide-eyed and overwhelmed by the attention, Gideon raised his hand to indicate that the ceremony was far from complete. The individual gifts were only the beginning of what the circle of generosity demanded. These offerings honor your kind heart, he explained. But the tradition requires something more, something that will ensure your generosity echoes through time itself. What Gideon had planned would transform not just Maggie's life, but the relationship between the settlement and the tribal community forever. Gideon Nash raised his arms toward the sky, and the entire circle of tribal members fell silent. The weight of ancient tradition hung in the air as he began to speak in his native language, his voice carrying a rhythmic quality that seemed to connect with something deeper than words. Sterling translated quietly for Clementine and Maggie, his whispered words carrying the gravity of what was unfolding. He's telling the spirits of our ancestors about your daughter's pure heart, Sterling explained. He's asking them to witness what happens next. As Gideon's ceremonial words concluded, he turned to face Maggie directly. His expression carried both kindness and profound seriousness as he knelt before the small girl who had unknowingly triggered this ancient response. Little one with the generous spirit, he said, switching back to English so she would understand every word. The circle of generosity demands that we honor your sacrifice in a way that will be remembered for generations. You gave your only protection against winter to comfort a stranger. This act reveals a spirit worthy of our highest recognition. From behind him, two tribal women approached carrying something that made Clementine gasp audibly. It was a coat unlike anything she had ever seen, crafted from the finest materials the community possessed. The outer layer was made from soft, tanned leather, decorated with intricate beadwork that depicted scenes of generosity and kindness. The inner lining was thick fur that would provide warmth far superior to any store-bought garment. But as beautiful as the coat was, Gideon's next words revealed that it represented something far more significant than mere clothing. "This coat carries our family's protection," he announced. "Any child who wears it is considered under the care of our entire tribe. If you ever face danger, hunger, or need, you need only present yourself to any of our people, and you will be protected as if you were our own daughter." The elderly woman who had first offered the moccasins stepped forward again, carrying a small pendant made from carved bone and precious stones. "This symbol will be recognized by any of our people, anywhere they might travel. It marks you as one who has proven the purity of her heart." Sterling's eyes misted as he watched the ceremony unfold. He had lived long enough to see this tradition performed only twice before, both times for acts of extraordinary courage or sacrifice by adults. Never had he witnessed it bestowed upon a child, and never for such a simple yet profound act of human kindness. Clementine struggled to comprehend the magnitude of what was happening. These people were essentially adopting her daughter into their extended family, offering protection and support that could last a lifetime. The generosity was overwhelming, but she could see in their faces that this wasn't charity. It was recognition of something they considered sacred. As the ceremonial coat was placed around Maggie's shoulders, the entire tribal community began to sing. Their voices rose together in a harmony that seemed to make the very air vibrate with power and meaning. The song was ancient, passed down through generations, sung only during the most significant ceremonies. Maggie looked up at her mother, still not fully grasping the weight of what had transpired, but understanding that something important and beautiful was happening. The coat fit her perfectly, as if it had been made specifically for her small frame, and the warmth it provided was unlike anything she had ever experienced. But as the singing reached its crescendo, Gideon raised his hand once more. The final element of the circle of generosity was yet to come, the part that would ensure this moment echoed beyond the immediate participants. "Tomorrow," he announced, "we will visit your settlement. We will tell everyone what we have witnessed here, and we will establish a new tradition between our peoples." What happened next would change the relationship between the two communities forever, creating a bond built on the foundation of one small girl's generous heart. The next morning, the townspeople of the settlement gathered in unusual numbers around the trading post, drawn by rumors of what had transpired the previous evening. Word had spread quickly about Clementine and Maggie's visit to the tribal community, though details remained scarce and speculation ran wild. Some expressed concern, others curiosity, and a few showed obvious skepticism about any positive interaction with the native population. Henrik stood near his shop, shaking his head as he spoke to anyone who would listen. "Mark my words, they're planning something. No good ever comes from getting too involved with those people." But Martha the schoolteacher disagreed strongly. Having noticed the remarkable transformation in Maggie's appearance, the child wore the most beautiful coat anyone in the settlement had ever seen, its craftsmanship clearly representing skills and materials far beyond what their small community could produce. As the morning progressed, a distinctive sound began to echo across the landscape, the rhythmic beating of drums accompanied by voices raised in harmony. The townspeople turned toward the eastern path, where a procession was approaching that would leave them speechless. Gideon Nash led the group, walking with the dignified bearing of a leader, conducting official business. Behind him came Sterling, still wearing Maggie's original small coat as a symbol of what had initiated this unprecedented event. Following them were representatives from every family in the tribal settlement, all dressed in their finest ceremonial clothing and carrying items that clearly held significant meaning. The procession moved with purpose and solemnity, their destination clearly the heart of the settlement where the largest number of people had gathered. As they approached, the drumming ceased, and an expectant silence fell over both groups. Gideon stepped forward, his voice carrying clearly across the assembled crowd. "People of this settlement, we come to share with you a story that must be told and remembered." He gestured toward Maggie, who stood close to her mother, still wearing the magnificent ceremonial coat. Yesterday, this child performed an act of pure generosity that awakened our most sacred tradition. She gave her only protection against winter to comfort a stranger, asking for nothing in return. Sterling moved to stand beside Gideon, adding his testimony to the account. I was that stranger, cold and suffering, ignored by many who passed. Only this little one saw my need and acted without hesitation. The tribal leader continued, explaining the significance of the circle of generosity and how rarely it was invoked. He described the ancient protocols that demanded extraordinary recognition for extraordinary kindness, and how Maggie's selfless act had triggered a response that hadn't been seen in over 30 years. Several townspeople exchanged glances, beginning to understand that they were witnessing something far more significant than a simple expression of gratitude. The formal nature of the presentation, the obvious importance placed on the ceremony, and the valuable gifts clearly visible in the tribal delegation all pointed to an event of genuine historical importance. But Gideon wasn't finished. The final element of his announcement would establish something unprecedented between the two communities. From this day forward, he declared, we propose a new tradition between our peoples, one that honors the spirit this child has shown us all. Gideon Nash's words hung in the morning air as he prepared to announce something that would forever change the relationship between the settlement and the tribal community. The gathered townspeople leaned forward, sensing the weight of the moment, while Maggie stood quietly beside her mother, still not fully comprehending how her simple act of kindness had led to this extraordinary gathering. We propose the establishment of the generous heart ceremony, Gideon continued, his voice carrying the authority of generations of leadership. Each year, on the anniversary of this day, our communities will come together to recognize and honor acts of selfless kindness performed by any person, regardless of age or background. Sterling stepped forward, carrying a beautifully crafted wooden staff adorned with symbols representing both communities. This staff will travel between our peoples, marking those who demonstrate the pure generosity that your daughter has shown. It will remind us all that kindness knows no boundaries of heritage or tradition. The crowd stirred with murmurs of amazement and consideration. Such formal cooperation between the communities had never been proposed before, and the implications were significant. Trade relationships existed, but this suggested something deeper, a shared commitment to recognizing and encouraging the best aspects of human nature. Martha, the schoolteacher, was the first to speak up. This is remarkable, to think that one child's kindness could bridge our communities in such a meaningful way. Even Henrik, despite his earlier skepticism, found himself moved by the gravity and sincerity of the proposal. The obvious care and effort the tribal community had invested in honoring Maggie's act made it clear this was no casual gesture or political maneuvering. Clementine looked down at her daughter, who was beginning to understand that her simple decision to share her coat had created something much larger than herself. The 8-year-old's eyes were wide with wonder as she processed the fact that adults from two different communities were planning to create a lasting tradition based on what she had done. Gideon knelt before Maggie one final time, his expression gentle but serious. Little one, you have shown us that the truest strength comes from a generous heart. The tradition we establish today will ensure that your spirit of giving inspires others for generations to come. He placed a small, intricately carved medallion in her hands. This is the first generous heart token. It represents not just what you did, but what you chose to see. The need of another person as more important than your own comfort. As the ceremony concluded, members of both communities began to mingle in ways that had rarely happened before. The tribal delegation shared stories of their traditions, while townspeople expressed genuine interest in learning more about their neighbors. Children from both groups gravitated toward each other, drawn by natural curiosity and the example of kindness they had just witnessed. The wooden staff was placed in the care of the settlement's leader, with the understanding that it would travel between communities as acts of generosity were recognized and celebrated. The first annual Generous Heart ceremony was scheduled for exactly 1 year from that day, with both communities committed to participating. As the tribal procession prepared to return to their settlement, Sterling approached Maggie one last time. He carefully removed her original small coat, which he had worn throughout the ceremony as a symbol of what had started everything. This belongs to you, he said, placing it gently in her hands. But I hope you will keep it as a reminder that sometimes the smallest gestures create the greatest changes. Maggie looked up at the elderly man who had received her kindness and smiled. I'll remember, Mr. Sterling, and I'll try to keep helping people who need it. As the tribal delegation disappeared over the eastern hills, the settlement buzzed with conversation about what they had witnessed. The story of Maggie's generous heart would be told and retold, becoming part of the local legend that would inspire countless future acts of kindness. The little girl who had simply seen someone in need and acted without hesitation had unknowingly planted the seeds of a tradition that would flourish for generations, proving that sometimes the most profound changes begin with the purest intentions of a generous heart. If you enjoyed this story, click the video on your screen now to watch another unforgettable tale where courage and compassion create unexpected bonds in the untamed frontier. Don't forget to subscribe and consider a super chat to help us keep bringing you more inspiring stories like these. Your support means everything to us.